Welcome everyone. My name is Kaaren Koomen and I want to thank you for participating today in the IBM Policy Lab event recorded here in Sydney, Australia on generative AI, Australian and global perspectives. The IBM Policy Lab is a forum that's designed to promote debate, discussion and leadership in responsible technology policy around the world. And so I'm delighted to have three experts here to have a discussion today. And to introduce our speakers, first we have Donna Forlin, who's the Trust Architect at the National AI Centre and who is leading the work here on developing a voluntary AI standard for Australian industry. Second, we have Louise McGrath, the Head of Industry Development and Policy for the Australian Industry Group. She's a member of the CSIRO's Responsible Use of AI at Scale think tank and the government's Manufacturing Advisory Group, amongst other things. And Ryan Hagemann, IBM's Global AI Policy Lead and Co-Director of the IBM Policy Lab, who's with us in Australia this week to talk to policymakers about global trends in AI policy and regulatory issues. So welcome to you all. Now, all of us here, and I expect most people watching, have spent much of the last 18 months or longer focusing on artificial intelligence and in particular generative AI from different perspectives. I think it's fair to say that after 30 years of an almost constant barrage of technological innovation, Gen AI seems to have captured the public's imagination, along with that of industry and policymakers, more than anything else since the arrival of the World Wide Web back in the early 1990s. The pace of change and the range of policy responses have been also unprecedented. And just in the last 24 hours, we've seen the European Union's AI Act pass its final hurdle. And as we speak, the UK and the Korean governments are hosting the AI Summit in Seoul, supported by 16 global companies from around the region and the world who've committed to a set of accountable governance structures and public transparency in relation to their development of AI. So lots is happening. But before we get into the detail of what we're doing here and how it aligns with what's happening internationally, I want to come to you, Donna, and ask you, why is Gen AI so important? Why are we having this conversation? Will it really change our lives?
It's a really good question in that, so generative AI is kind of that new wave of AI that's made AI accessible to everyone. Previously, AI has been in the hands of experts and specialists, and it hasn't been something that everyone can access, and that's fundamentally changed, which is changing the equation for business and for citizens in Australia and how AI can influence their lives. And it's a really interesting shift that we're seeing, and it's creating a bit of a paradox in that a recent LinkedIn survey shows that Australians, I think about 85% of Australians, are using generative AI in their day-to-day lives, but we're only seeing an adoption rate in business of about 29%. So that's a really interesting contrast. And what we are hearing anecdotally is that people are just using it in their work, but not officially. So they're using it in their home lives, they're bringing it into work, so you're getting this kind of shadow AI use, which is disrupting kind of the normal top-down flow of introduction of technology. And so that's something from the National AI Centre we're really looking at, of how do we start to accelerate business adoption of AI? How do we uplift responsible AI use capability across industry, as well as looking at how do we help foster a homegrown AI industry to help support the use of AI. So generative AI kind of hits all of those points, and it's just really accelerated the pace of everything to do with AI.
Indeed. Louise, Australian Industry Group has over 60,000 large and small businesses from around the country. It's been around for nearly a century. What does the AI Group think about the implications of AI for industry? Is it going to take jobs, create jobs, both?
Well, I think both. All new technology initially does take jobs, but it also creates new jobs, and that's what we want to focus on, is those opportunities. As per Donna's stats, we're really concerned that not enough companies are actually using AI, and there's a range of reasons. Sometimes it's because we use the word AI, but people don't buy AI, they buy a solution to a problem they need that might have some AI embedded in it, and it could be in robotics, and as you say, many people could be using it without realising it. There is also a concern around safety. both in terms of, do I own the data? What's the privacy implications of the data I'm using? What's the output, where that's going? So a lot of members are telling us that while they want to use it, they want to see what the opportunities are, they're really engaging with us when we have these big events, but they want some guardrails. As one member from the construction sector said to me, look, we used to think asbestos was safe. Companies have been around for a long time now, and with robo-debt in Australia, we just don't want to be caught out not knowing, not understanding, not being able to explain how decisions are made, what data's used, and inadvertently using it in a less than safe way.
Well, Ryan, you're based at the IBM headquarters of Government and Regulatory Affairs in Washington, DC, and you manage our position on AI policy globally. So you're at the centre of the issue, looking at what we're doing in 170 different countries. What are you seeing as some of the risks and the issues that are emerging around the world?
Yeah, one of the things that I hear often from policymakers all around the world is a recognition of all of the benefits that AI potentially heralds, right? Every country wants to be a leader in AI. But the revolutionary potential of the technology is matched only by the potential for harms, right? Louise mentioned a few of them, data privacy issues, but it's literally a laundry list, right? Supercharging scamsters, fraudsters, cybersecurity breaches being taken to a whole new level. AI does have the potential to do a lot of good in the world, but that good really is only matched by its potential for harm by nefarious actors. So for policymakers, I think it's top of mind for them, not only the benefits, but trying to address some of these harms. And particularly in an election year like one the world has never seen before, with a record number of people globally going to the polls, I think deepfakes is another one of those areas of harms that a lot of policymakers are really focused on and training their attention on trying to address.
We might come back to that in a minute, but there are many issues that seem to be emerging. And Donna, are these issues resonating with what the Australian or the National AI Centre is looking at and focusing on? And if so, what's the pathway to addressing these?
They're the same issues that we're seeing, locally, as I think every country in the world is experiencing. And so there's a couple of avenues that Australia as a whole is addressing these. Australia, through both government and CSIRO and the National AI Centre, we are engaging internationally with a lot of the bodies that are setting the standards. ISO, IEEE, OECD, looking at, what are the global best practices that we need to be putting in place to address some of these issues and provide a path for businesses to move forward and do so in a really safe and responsible way. We are also, through the National AI Centre, we have established our Responsible AI Network of businesses that are committed to responsible AI, and then we're working tirelessly to help provide them with best practices and guidance on how to address and avoid some of these well-known issues. And then on the third element that we're looking at is we are working with the Department of Industry to develop Australia's first voluntary AI safety standard, to put in place some of the guardrails and best practices so that businesses can be confident that they're doing the best that we know, noting that it'll change over time and evolve, but the best practices we know now to help put them in really good stead to avoid some of these large issues at play.
And what are some of those best practices that we might see in that voluntary standard?
So it'll be coming out soon. Can't get into too much detail, but it covers a lot of what people would expect. So governance, what governance needs to be put in place? What are the processes that you need to have so that you're confident that the ongoing use of the AI, so not just the initial deployment of it, but the use of it is also continuing in a safe and responsible way. What are the questions you need to be asking your vendors and suppliers of your AI system so that you understand the elements that Louise mentioned earlier? What data is being used? What are the privacy controls put in place? How is it secured? And so really just helping those that are using AI systems to understand where they should be asking questions, where should they be probing, and how should they be working with their suppliers to address and mitigate some of these issues.
I want to come to you, Ryan, and just ask whether that resonates with what you're seeing internationally. Are there is there a sort of trends that is emerging from the countries that you're looking at, and are these approaches being enforced by traditional legal frameworks and hard law, or are there other options that are emerging?
Yeah, I think, if we back up a little bit and go back 6, 7, 8 years, a lot of countries, a lot of companies, a lot of entities around the world were really talking about AI principles, right? At a high level, what can we all kind of agree are important sentiments that we all share, right? So things like human centricity, the need for humans in the loop, transparency, explainability, ensuring the protection of, civil rights and, basic human dignity and things like that. Now we're at a stage where those principles really have to start being put into practice. Frankly, they probably had to start being put into practice shortly after the principles were announced. And that's where we're seeing a lot more policy divergence in every different direction from various different countries. But the three general trends I see are countries are either going towards traditional hard law approaches to regulate and enforce the technology, or they're going towards soft law, which is basically just non-binding voluntary instruments, general guideposts for industry and non-government actors to follow, and then the hybrid approach, which is a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. I think the great obvious representatives of each of these categories is you've got the EU with the AI Act. They're charging ahead on hard law, comprehensive, broad approach to regulating AI. The US is a little bit more in that hybrid category, has traditionally relied on soft law for a lot of these issues, but now is seeing a need to actually transition more into some hard law on the margins. And then Singapore is sticking with its traditional soft law approach. It's been working pretty well for them, and they don't really see a need to change course. So I think the one big takeaway from all of this that I'm seeing around the globe is that there isn't the same sort of Brussels effect that we saw with GDPR and the privacy policy conversation. Every country wants to be a leader and an innovator in AI. Every country really wants to reap all of the benefits while mitigating against the harms. But countries don't necessarily all agree that the EU's particular hard law approach is necessarily right for them. So there's a lot of fit for purpose among different countries.
Interesting. So Louise, what's the AI group's view about this, or Australian industry's view from talking to people in various sectors?
So we've done a lot of work on just digital trade policy for some time. So if we're talking about the international space, and large companies like IBM, of course, have the resources that you could have different laws in every country, and that would be fine. Of course, mid-sized companies also export and also live in the digital world. They don't quite have those resources. So we do advocate for as much alignment as possible, and regulatory, not harmonisation, because that's too bridge too far for a lot of regulators, but at least alignment and some regulatory coherence. I once had a member say to me, I mustn't be quoting them all the time, but we don't care if they're actually bad laws now, as long as if they're all the same. So I'm not sure that that's what IBM would advocate for. But you can see their thinking. There's some efficiency in it. But things will be driven through free trade agreements, throughout the multilateral setting. What we learned through data privacy, data governance, there is no international body that's equipped to handle this sort of new discussion. WTO is not. It's not, standards. There isn't anyone, and similarly, I think in this case. And so the risk for companies is that it will be these plurilateral deals, such as CPTPP, or Singapore's creating its own one. ASEAN will do one, and then companies will pick and choose as best they can. I mean, it's a big ocean, and it's really hard to separate the pieces of water. But companies will navigate as best they can.
Well, if you do have multiple different regimes, you've got multiple costs, and but one of the things I think that has been emerging, and I think you've all mentioned the risks, and then the risk-based approach is something that we've been hearing a lot about. Certainly the EU is basing its whole regime, the AI Act, around the concept of a risk-based approach. And when we talk about it, though, in Australia, are we talking about the same thing? What is it that we are looking at, and the National AI Centre, in the context of risk-based approach to regulation?
We are looking at a risk-based approach, and particularly looking at the voluntary measures that we're leading on. We look at really understanding the risk to use that to then put in place the right level of controls and mitigation. There are some use cases that just don't warrant, a large regime of process and control. It's going to be overkill. For example, a company using generative AI to do a chatbot for their internal policy documents, there are things you can put in place that are light touch to really protect both your data and your employees in that situation. But on the other hand, if you are someone who is providing a recruitment solution that is using AI, that is extremely high risk, and therefore our risk-based approach says that that's where you focus your efforts in terms of your guardrails, your responsible AI practices, and make it an equivalent, based on the scenario, what is the appropriate level of action, and so using a risk-based approach that way. And so we do understand that the government, in the interim response that the government released in January, they did say that they are looking at a definition of high risk for Australia, and so that is something that we aren't taking a position on that until the government has put out the definition for Australia of what high risk is. But we're looking at how do we help enable and give industry the tools to do their own assessments and say, well, what is high risk for us and what is low risk, and therefore what are the practices we need to put in place?
Well, Louise, what does this mean for industry getting their head around this process?
Yeah, so we really focus on behaviours, and I think there's a lot of current regulation that will already control behaviour, undesired behaviour. So let's say false and misleading advertising to consumers or to customers. We're of the view, it doesn't matter if you're standing on a snake oil box or sending out faxes or using AI, it's the act that should be regulated rather than the technology, which is easy to say, but acknowledging that there are some ways that AI can accelerate and speed up the risk. In terms of recruitment, discrimination is already illegal in Australia. So do we need another overlay? What are we trying to protect here when these rights already exist? And so I think we have to be careful. There is, as Ryan said, policymakers are concerned with the speed of AI and it can get away from you, but we're all human still, and it's human behaviour that we're trying to control, and that's, I think, where we need to start with.
I think the University of Technology Sydney's Human Technology Institute's done some interesting work on sort of a gap analysis of the existing laws, and I think they found between 8 and 10 areas of laws that need to be addressed to ensure that they do apply in appropriate cases. But it's not a ground zero.
Yeah.
This is not a blank field. So Ryan, what are you seeing in this area internationally? Should assessments be based on risk, and is there a trend to look at risk of use or risk per sector? So is AI being used, or should it be used in the medical or financial services sector? As a result of that, then should they have a higher level of regulation, or is it just the use case?
Yeah, well, I do find it interesting that pretty much every country I look at does claim that their approach is in fact a risk-based approach, right? That's another area where pretty much everyone agrees we want a risk-based approach, but everyone sort of disagrees on what that actually looks like in practice, right? And so when I think about risk, there's basically two constituent elements there. There's the probability of a harm occurring, and there's a magnitude or an impact of that harm, right? So there are a lot of harms that are very benign. They're not likely to impact people in a severe way or a meaningful way or a consequential way, but there's a high probability of them occurring, and vice versa. Right? So I think in terms of managing risk, what you really have to look at, because you can't really, as an entity, necessarily manage the magnitude of the harm, you can manage the probability of the harm actually occurring, right? And so I think the place that it makes the most sense to attach a lot of obligations is on that point at which the technology is actually interacting with the individual. And actually meeting society, right? And so for a lot of risk-based approaches, I think there's an understanding that deployers need to do certain things to be held accountable for some of the decisions they make in putting that technology directly interfacing with individuals. That doesn't mean that developers don't have obligations that they need to abide by as well, but I do think that it's important to distinguish those two categories of organizations and entities and make sure that the accountability mechanisms that are foisted upon them are appropriate to the role in which they occupy in the larger AI ecosystem.
And that'll give rise to the issue of defining deployers and developers and the fun and joy that will flow from that.
It's a never-ending fun rabbit hole, yes.
Great business for lawyers. One of the things you mentioned before was deep fakes, and it is one of the challenges that's emerging. In addition to the harm and the anguish it causes to individuals. This year, I think some half the world's population are facing elections, and the use of deep fakes to manipulate images and information and public debate can have very serious consequences. So, Ryan, is this being considered in the US, and what approaches are being proposed?
It is. It's being considered essentially at all levels of government, from municipal, city level to state level to the federal level. In the United States, a lot of how we run our elections are actually managed at the municipal and the state level, but there is a lot of attention from federal lawmakers as well. So we have the Federal Elections Commission. There are rules by which candidates have to abide when they're operating in elections. IBM has actually come out in support of a bill from Senator Klobuchar, which, if I'm getting my days right, being here in Australia and thinking about where the U.S. is, it should be actually up for a markup in the Senate Rules Committee later tomorrow. And that bill would basically say that deep fakes that are used by candidates or by organizations supporting candidates would have criminal liability attached to them if they are used in a way that is not transparent. And if they are also used in a way that essentially intends to negatively influence the outcome of an election. It gets tricky in the United States because we also have the First Amendment, so there's a lot of groups that offer concerns regarding whether or not these types of approaches are pushing too far up against that First Amendment in our Constitution. But I think there's a recognition in the United States and elsewhere that however individual countries and policymakers are going to be managing this issue, it is a priority issue, because the last thing you want is an ill-informed electorate being further ill-informed by misinformation that's being generated with the specific intention of deluding them into doing something that they otherwise would not do.
Donna, is this something that the National AI Centre is looking at?
So it is something that is of concern for the Australian ecosystem. The eSafety Commissioner is doing a lot of work in this space, particularly around protecting vulnerable people, child abuse material, pornography, deepfakes, a lot of problematic content. So the eSafety Commissioner is leading the charge in that space, and we are, from a National AI Centre perspective, really looking at, what are the things that we can put in place, and what are the best practices that we can encourage in industry around transparency, in ensuring that people know where content has come from, where data is being used and how it's changed over the life cycle. And so that's something that through our Responsible AI network and some of the material that will be coming and best practices over the coming months, we'll start to address. But from a policy perspective, the eSafety Commissioner is leading the charge.
So Louise, is this something that industry is concerned about? Or?
Well, our members are mainly in the B2B, industrial space. There is always risk, but there's been risk for a lot of our members, on stealing IP and copyright and all that kind of stuff, which is part of this debate. So it's not something immediate that's come up, but I think, so a lot of, when we did our, because it's linked to cybersecurity, when we did our cybersecurity report with members, to understand the scale of the issue, we found that the large companies, have got problems, but they've got the resources. Small companies don't really have anything to steal, so they're kind of left alone. But that mid-size, which is, big segment of the Australian industrial landscape, big enough to have data to steal, but not big enough to have the resources to really protect themselves, which is why they're so vulnerable to ransomware attacks, etc. What that means in a deep fake, the CEO ringing and saying, hey, send that money today. They've already, we're already seeing instances where invoices are being, stopped and changed with bank account details, all that kind of stuff. A deep fake would potentially elevate that. So we're really thinking of it as more of a cybersecurity issue and data protection.
Interesting. I think we touched on earlier the issues of global regulation, and then there were some calls, a while back about having a global regulator. I think Elon Musk had a view, and and I think with the current world as it is, getting a global agreement on this issue in terms of a regulator is some way off. But just coming back to domestic jurisdictions, is having a single regulator dealing with this space something that is being considered, at least in the Australian context? Does the National AI Centre see a path to having a single regulator, or do all of the current regulators, the ACCC, ASIC, eSafety Commissioner, Privacy Commissioner, do they all need to become experts in AI?
So I'm not aware of a single regulator discussion in government. We can say that the government is looking at regulation options, in that they, through the interim response released in January, they listed a number of measures that they're looking at around, mandatory guardrail options, watermarking and labelling requirements, the voluntary piece of work we're working on, and there is a fourth and the expert advisory committee to help advise them. So we know they're thinking about it. I can't sort of say any more around that single regulator piece, but we do know the existing regulators are looking at AI. They have existing regulation that applies to AI use and AI systems. As Louise mentioned earlier, it's not, we're not in a ground zero greenfield scenario where there is no regulation. And we do know that there's a lot of work happening within those regulators to skill up on AI. For example, you mentioned the Human Technology Institute. They ran a session this week with regulators like ASIC, ACCC, eSafety Commissioner and others to talk about the issues about AI, how it applies to their regulation. So we're seeing that upskilling conversation happening right now to help those existing regulators really look at how AI is either affecting the way that they enforce regulation, or are looking at how they provide guidance on how to comply with their regulation.
So Ryan, what are you seeing, looking at it from a global perspective?
Well, in general, everyone has a different thought on this, right? I think what I see a lot from policymakers is a desire not to stand up new institutions for the most part. There is a recognition that countries around the world have built up over many, many decades, in some cases, a large body of expertise in existing institutions and agencies that already manage discrete portions of the economy and regulate market failures therein. So I think there's a general understanding that it's better to go to war with the army that you have right now in order to fight the battle immediately, as opposed to waiting for that perfect army to go fight, potentially better, but potentially worse. One of the points that I make a lot to policymakers in the United States when this idea of a single national regulator comes up, specifically for AI, is, in the US we have about, it's tough to count, but usually the number is quoted at about 494 separate regulatory agencies with actual enforcement authority over certain portions of the economy. The idea that turning that number into 495 and making that 495th regulator responsible for all of the economy seems like a little bit of a tough hill for a lot of folks to climb intellectually. So I think the place that makes the most sense for policymakers to focus their time and attention is leveraging existing statutory authorities, leveraging existing agencies and their staffs, and to the point about gap analysis, looking at where it is you maybe need to beef up resources and enforcement in the future, but probably not best to try to reinvent the wheel here.
There's a lot of centralised power, not to mention, the expertise that they'd need to cover all those sectors. So, Donna, you mentioned at the beginning the low level of take-up from business, and I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about what the National AI Centre is doing to try and promote the benefits of AI across the business community, amongst others.
So we have a number of initiatives that are working with the business community to really, tackle this on multiple dimensions. One is around education and just understanding and capability uplift. So we run fortnightly webinars across a range of different subjects, just to provide the opportunity for industry to just skill up, hear the conversation, learn more about what's happening in AI and what the opportunity really is. For them. We also have developed our Responsible AI Network, which is a series of companies that are committed to responsible AI and really looking at how they can help provide, material, examples, use cases of how do we as Australians, how can we capitalise that benefit for AI and how do we use it? We also are actively working on connecting AI businesses, so those that are making AI services, AI products, or are incorporating AI into their existing products and services, with businesses who are looking at solving a problem where AI could potentially be really, really helpful. And we do a lot of work with the Australian Industry Group, and we run quarterly events where we bring these two groups together, where they can connect and understand what's happening in the technology space, but also how it applies to their business, and particularly around themes. So we're really looking at it from an education perspective, an opportunity perspective, and really highlighting what the opportunity is, and then connecting and how do we bring those networks together and really try and uplift Australian business as a whole.
And I know that IBM is part of the process of contributing what we've learnt in this environment.
Exactly,
to that process.
and we're really relying on a lot of the larger companies who have experience and have the expertise, like IBM, to really contribute that best practice and knowledge that we can share with companies who are kind of earlier in their journey. And the more we can make it less scary, the more we can make it clear that there is a path forward that's achievable, the easier it is for business to start down that path.
Thanks. And I know you, Louise, are also very active in trying to promote greater use, responsible use of AI. What are some of the things that you're
working with NAIC has been invaluable. What we understand is that if a company, because of course companies don't buy AI, they buy a solution to a problem. But when they go to buy it, they end up going to sometimes up to 7 different vendors, with someone might have systems, someone else the sensors and tech and hardware and all sorts of things. So by working with NAIC and having that connection with the local ecosystem, it's reduced a lot of that noise and enabled so many companies to really understand what the opportunity is. We started off initially by showcasing AI tools within safety, because within the Australian context, safety is already a high-level order issue. The business case is already written. It won't affect production. So we think it's a good way for a lot of companies to start. And also everyone in the company will have something to do with it because it is safety. And, I think you were at one of the sessions out at Clayton. Fantastic, really, really practical, monitoring sort of fatigue in drivers, to hazard reduction in warehousing, to monitoring proper lift techniques, all sorts of things, really practical uses of AI, and changes the conversation from this is a risk we have to manage to actually this is a way to manage other risks.
And there are absolutely productivity gains to be made if it can be rolled out responsibly. Ryan, at the same time as we've been looking at what governments are doing and industry bodies are doing, some companies, like IBM, have also been developing their own internal governance regimes and ethical approaches to the issues raised by AI. I just wondered if you could outline a little of what IBM's approach has been.
Sure. So we have our long-standing trust and transparency principles that have guided a lot of the way we think about not only developing technology, but then deploying it out there in the real world. Over the last 10 plus years or so, though, we've developed internally this idea of an AI ethics board. And what the ethics board does at IBM is it essentially serves as a centralized clearinghouse to inform decisions that we're making about what products we will not only develop, but what products we will help clients develop as well. So we think of it as both a top-down, but also a bottom-up federated approach. So AI Focals represent the various different business divisions within IBM. They're linked to senior members of the company who sit on the AI ethics board. And decisions that individual divisions want to have made by the AI Ethics Board, clarity that they maybe need if they're going to pursue particular contracts or particular developments in technology. They have a single point of contact that they can go to, and that point of contact can then bring those proposals and those ideas to the board that will review it based on those trust and transparency principles, but also a wide range of other mechanisms that we've developed for internal accountability. And a lot of this has actually now, shall we say, matriculated into some of our more recent product offerings, like our Watson X suite of products. So we have not only eaten our own cooking at IBM when it comes to promoting trust internally and developing these accountability mechanisms, but we think we're in a very good position in the market to help many other large companies that maybe don't have this experience start to integrate some of these features into their own internal development practices around how they're thinking about both building AI themselves and adopting AI that they might license from other companies.
Well, I know that IBM's been working on some of those governance regimes for, the better part of a decade or more. So if you want to introduce AI, you often, once you've made that decision, you want to do it very quickly. So, an opportunity to take that as a guide or a reference or holus bolus if you wish, but there are, available tools. So I think we've done a quick purvey of the scene. There's a lot happening. We're on an exciting journey from a technology point of view and also a regulatory point of view. Many challenges, but a lot of attention and focus on trying to create some outcomes and recommendations to deal with this brave new world. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask each of you what you think you might see over the next 12 months.
Excellent question. Look, it's a crystal ball answer of, no one knows for certain. I think we're going to see significant changes in supply chains. I think the supply chain for AI is at the point where we're going to see that infusing of responsible and safe practices and also more transparency and visibility. So I think the supply chain, AI supply chain, is going to get a lot more focus and is going to become a lot clearer for everyone. I also think we're going to see, rapid shifts in regulatory environments and how companies are going to really work within that. I think we don't yet know what that's going to look like and what that requirement is going to be on companies, so there's going to be a big shift there. And I also think we're just going to see overall a hopefully huge uplift in understanding and capability, so the conversation's going to change. Our conversation around responsible AI at the moment is really making sure that everyone understands what it is and understands risks and harms and is thinking in that way. I think we're going to see a massive shift in that conversation as everyone's getting up to speed, and it'll become more nuanced, and we'll get to a point where we're really talking about opportunity and opportunity cost rather than just risk. So that's my prediction.
Thank you. Louise, what are your thoughts?
I'm similarly optimistic. As I said from the outset, a lot of our members are keen to use it, but would like some guardrails so that they have confidence when they're using it. And I think so as the conversation changes, we get some surety on what those guardrails might be. I'm really hopeful that will drive a lot of companies to start using it. And I think the economics has changed. We don't have unlimited skills and staff available, and so it's really changing the investment decision as well.
In fact, we have a lot of skill shortages.
That's it.
It's a political and economic challenge, so maybe some issues.
And I also think it's going to be really important in that decarbonisation journey, because you can't change what you don't measure, and so the two are really linked.
Yes, very good point. And Ryan, what are you seeing from your bird's eye view?
On my perch, yes. It's a great question. I think over the next 12 to 18 months, what we're going to see is true policy leadership and AI governance really start to emerge at the national level. We're entering a phase now where the EU has gotten to tell the world that they're leading the charge and they're out ahead on AI regulation. But now that we're entering implementation phase, this is where the rubber really meets the road, and we see whether or not what Brussels has cobbled together can actually land relatively softly with all of the different member states that have to do the really tough work of figuring out how to implement the rules. So I think the next 12 to 18 months will show us whether or not that type of hard law actually works and makes sense not just for business, but for the societies in which AI is being governed by those rules, or if something more like the Singaporean soft law approach ends up winning out, or if the hybrid approach wins out. So I think these next 18 months or so are pretty key, but I'm pretty sure that by the end of it, we'll at least have a better sense of who's really leading the pack in terms of effective regulatory governance approaches for artificial intelligence.
Well, thank you all. It's clear to me we're living in a very exciting time to be in technology and regulation.